So I want to talk to us today about trauma. And as soon as I say I'm talking on trauma, there's immediately it splits the audience into two groups of people. And the first group is saying, awesome, I want to hear more about trauma. And the second group of people saying, oh, no, we're talking about trauma again. Can't we just speak about something else? Can't we just speak about the gospel? Friends, I think recovering from trauma and recovery from trauma is absolutely a gospel issue. What sin does is it traumatizes us. So in essence, every one of us is trying to recover from the effects of sin as we become more Christ-like. Recovering from the effects of sin is recovering from trauma. It's the trauma of sin. Can you imagine being Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden in perfection with God, in a perfect relationship, and then the trauma of that relationship being severed? And I can remember having a newborn baby, my first son, and looking at him and holding him in my arms, and he looked perfect because he looked a lot like me. And as I looked into his face, he was peaceful and he looked like a little angel. And then the nurse came along with this injection and just stabbed it into his leg. And I watched his face change from this picture of peace and perfection to just horror and trauma on his face. And I thought to myself, that's what sin does to us, friends. Sin traumatizes us. And so is trauma and recovery from trauma a gospel issue? Absolutely. It is the gospel issue. Part of living life to the fullest, the fullness of life that Jesus came to give us, part of that is health and wholeness here on earth. And so I want to speak about trauma again today, and address a trauma and looking at a trauma-informed approach. And I just want to say up front, I'm not a professional, I'm not a psychologist or a medical doctor. I'm a scholar, I'm a pastor, and so I'm approaching it from that side. And I've done a little bit of scholarly work on it, a little bit of research, but I want to look at it primarily from a pastoral point of view and how we should respond to, identify, and address trauma. So I'm speaking about a trauma-informed response. And so it's firstly, what is a trauma-informed response? Trauma-informed response causes us to approach people and situations with an awareness of trauma. It's that simple. You know what my favorite things are? Rumble strips. A few years ago, they were busy tarring the road out to Shishlui Game Reserve. It goes through a rural area, and they were re-tarring it. And what they'd done was they'd tarred the road and they'd built the speed bumps, but they hadn't yet built the rumble strips. And the rumble strips are those little things that go grrr, grrr before you get to the speed bump, right? So they hadn't built those yet. They'd just built the speed bumps. And a friend of mine and myself were going out to the game reserve for the weekend, and so he'd packed a bottle of wine in my bag because he didn't want to lose it or damage it. And so he'd wrapped it in my sleeping bag, put it in my bag by my pillow and my clothes so that it was safe. And so we were talking as we went along this newly tarred road. It was smooth and straight, and he was probably going way too fast. And without realizing it, not concentrating on the road, the next thing we knew, the car was off the ground and we had launched into orbit off the speed bump. As we hit it at about 80, 90 k's an hour, we hit the speed bump. And as we landed, obviously everything was pandemonium, bags flying everywhere. We hit our heads and the car swerved and almost went off the road. And everything was fine, and we forgot about it until we got into the gate. And I got to the camp, opened my bag, and there was, where once there was a sleeping bag and a pillow, was now the remnants of a bottle of wine all over my sleeping bag and pillow. And that speed bump had caused a disaster for my weekend. And as they continued the development, they then put the rumble strips in. And so now, if you're driving along that same road, as you're approaching the speed bump, if you're not concentrating on the road, the speed bumps go grrr, grrr, the rumble strips grrr, grrr, before you get to the speed bump, and so it avoids potential disaster, popping a bottle of wine all over your pillow and sleeping bag. And that's very simply what a trauma-informed approach does. It's the rumble strips, and so that every speed bump that we hit isn't an absolute disaster. And that's simply what I want to do today, because we want to care for people's mental, physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual well-being. That's what the gospel calls us to do, right? Because we want a healthy family, because we're not just a family, we're a family on a mission, and a healthy family will have a fruitful mission. And so if we want to focus on a fruitful mission, we need to also focus on a healthy family so that we can have a fruitful mission. And part of that is recovery of trauma and having an approach that is informed by trauma, and that's why it's important. And so I want to look at start off by how we define trauma, and we look at trauma in three categories. It's events, our experience of those events, and then the long-term effects or short-term effects of those events. So it's three categories. And I think very often we think of trauma only as an event, and we don't take into account, or we pay less attention to the how people experience that trauma, and then the short and long-term effects of that trauma. And so people say, well, if trauma is just an event, then you can move on from it, right? You can move on from an event. But if there are persisting effects and experiences that haven't been processed and dealt with, then no, we can't move on from it, because it's not just an event. So if we take, for example, in this country, South Africa, apartheid. If apartheid was just an event, 27 years later, can't we just move on from it, the trauma of apartheid? If it's just an event, yes, then we can move on from it, and we should. But for many people, their experiences are still being experienced. Their experiences haven't been expressed and told to anybody. And they're still living in the long-term effects of that event. And so, no, we can't just move on from it. Until we've dealt with people's experiences and the effects of it, we cannot move on from simply a traumatic event. We have to deal with all three. And if we look at understanding trauma, the trauma is a complex and layered beast. So there's societal trauma, there's communal trauma, and then there's individual trauma, right? And I say trauma is compounded. I'm not sure if you are aware of the power. You must have heard one of those seminars on the power of compound interest. And the story goes that there was a samurai warrior in Japan, and he saved the Japanese emperor from whoever the invading force was, and he was the hero of the day. And he came to the emperor, and the emperor said to him, "What can I give you? Anything in Japan, what can I give you as a gift to say thank you for saving the country?" And so the samurai's response was, "Give me 1 grain of rice." And the emperor said to him, "What do you mean 1 grain of rice?" He said, "No, give me 1 grain of rice and then double it for every square on the chessboard." And so the emperor thought to himself, "I've got away with murder here. That sounds like a very small task." As that piece of rice compounds, they realized that there wasn't enough rice in all of Japan to supply this man's request. And so what trauma does is, it might not seem like a lot, it might just seem like a grain of rice, but as we compound it on those 3 layers, we realize there's actually a lot more rice than we thought there was, and we actually realize there's a lot more trauma that we are dealing with than we thought we were. Trauma, friends, compounds. It doubles down on itself, and it goes deeper, and it takes root. It affects us on a societal, a communal, and an individual level. So the events on a societal level, traumatic events on a societal level, is obviously war, natural disaster, pandemics. They affect, those events are experienced by the majority of society. So the Second World War, for example, traumatized the European society for years to come. It traumatized everybody that took place in the war, but it traumatized more than that. The society of Europe was traumatized by that. And natural disasters such as the tsunami that hit Indonesia in 2004. Friends, the Indonesian society was traumatized by that natural disaster, that event. A pandemic like we're going through at the moment traumatizes us, yes, individually, yes, communally, but before that, our society is traumatized by that event, because it affects all of us. The whole of society is under the same event. Yes, our experience of that event is different from person to person, and yes, the effects of that event are different from person to person. But on an event level, that is a societal trauma. Then on a communal level, poverty, discrimination, violence seen. Those are events that traumatize a community. Do you know that poverty traumatizes a community? See, because poverty is not only an event, it's also an experience and an effect. Poverty causes damage to people's mental, physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual wellness. Remember, we said we want to see health in those 5 areas because we want a healthy family that can have a fruitful mission. And so poverty traumatizes a community. Communities live together who are in poverty. Poverty is far more than financial. Discrimination traumatizes people on a communal level because there's groups of people, there's communities that suffer the same discrimination together. And so when we discriminate, we invariably discriminate along communal lines, a race group, a gender group, a class group, a tribe. And we class people, communities together that we then discriminate against. violence at the door. Violence is at the door of certain communities and of certain families. So for many people, violence is 1 or 2 steps removed. For many people, for many communities, violence is often seen. Violence is in a community, and that traumatizes a community on a communal level, those events. And then on an individual level, loss, abuse, neglect, violence, experience. This is not by any means an exhaustive list, but loss. Loss is not just you lost somebody through death. Sometimes we lose relationships. Sometimes we lose things. And I understand that not every time we lose something we are traumatized, but very often that loss does traumatize us. And if you were to take 30 seconds to pause it now or at the end of this talk, just to look at some of the things that you have lost, people or things, relationships perhaps that you've lost even if the person hasn't passed away. You were to do an inventory of loss, I think you would understand that some of those losses have traumatized you. Obviously, abuse and neglect, there's varying degrees and varying severities of it, short-term and long-term, etc. But those things traumatize us as individuals. And then violence experienced. And so we see on a communal level, we see violence, but on an individual level, it's not violence that's at the gate. It's violence that is in my house. I've experienced it. I've been subject to violence. It might be mugging, it might be hijacking, it might be whatever it might be. I've experienced violence myself. I haven't just seen it. And that's an individual trauma. It's more than violence observed. It's violence being seen. And so I want to take a minute to talk about the brain. Now, if my biology teacher was still alive and he was to listen to John Cilliers speak about the brain, he would be rolling in his grave right now because I didn't take biology after grade 9. But I want to take a minute just to speak about the brain. The brain's obviously broken up into a left and a right hemisphere, but it's also broken up into 3 parts. And I want to discuss how the brain is formed, how the brain functions, and then how trauma affects that form and function of the brain. So it's 3 parts of the brain. The bottom layer of your brain is the brain stem, and that controls your basic functioning of your brain. I'm not sure if you've looked at people and thought that person is just basically functioning, right? It could just be that they're living from their brain stem, and it controls basic functioning like your breathing, like your organs. It keeps your blood pumping around your body. That's what your brain stem does, right? That determines you are alive. If your brain stem is not functioning, you need to be on life support to still be alive. So that's the most basic functioning of your brain, is your brain stem. Then above that is your limbic system, and the limbic system controls the relation between the organism and its surroundings, and it's your emotional relevance. So your limbic system is where you socialize. Why do you like somebody? Why do you like certain people? Why are you drawn to certain friends and not to others? They're not just because, so dogs are drawn to other dogs, right? They're not drawn to a personality because they have no social life, right? They just like dogs because they're dogs. Why do you like certain people? Why do you find certain people attractive? It's your emotional relevance. It's the relation that you as the organism have to the environment around you. That's controlled by your limbic system. This is also where your amygdala lives. Your amygdala controls your fight or flight response, right? So it's how you respond to situations. When something happens to me, how do I respond to it? That's out of an emotional place and out of my amygdala. That's controlled by my limbic system. And having a functioning limbic system is what makes us a mammal, right? That the brain stem is what's known as the lizard brain, because it's a reptile brain. That's the basic functioning. The limbic system is known as the mammal brain. It's higher functioning. And then the highest functioning part of your brain is called your prefrontal cortex. And your prefrontal cortex determines your planning and your anticipation. It's where you get your inhibitions from, and it's your emphatic understanding of yourself. So this is if you have a highly developed and functioning prefrontal cortex, this is what makes you a human. It's what makes you a functioning member of society, right? Here's the interesting thing about a prefrontal cortex. It only fully develops at age 25. So we expect certain things from our kids and our teenagers, and things like planning and anticipation, inhibitions, emphatic understanding. We're expecting 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds to have that sort of thing. 16, 17, 18-year-olds. No, you're an adult, you need to have that. The prefrontal cortex only fully develops at age 25. Also, if during the development, so under the age of 25, while it's developing, there is a trauma that's suffered, it can stunt the growth it can stunt the development of that prefrontal cortex, and it might not fully develop. And that's why kids have no inhibitions, right? My 8-year-old would have no inhibition to stand on stage and speak to a crowd without a shirt on. He doesn't have inhibitions, right? As you get over the age of 25, I trust that you have enough inhibitions to not do that because your prefrontal cortex is fully functioning. Here's what's interesting, right? The brain develops from the bottom up. So the first part of the brain to develop in the womb is the brainstem, then the limbic system, then the prefrontal cortex at around age 25. It's fully developed, or it's fully developed, although it might not be fully functioning in every single person. I get that, but it's fully developed. What trauma does is that it affects our brain from the top to the bottom. So it develops from the bottom to the top. Trauma affects our brain from the top to the bottom. So the first part of the brain that is affected by trauma is the prefrontal cortex. So everything that the prefrontal cortex is controlling, your planning and anticipation, your inhibitions, your emphatic understanding, your higher reasoning, that's the first thing that's affected by trauma. Then it becomes your relation between yourself and how you relate to your surroundings, your emotional intelligence, your emotional relevance. As the trauma then gets into your limbic system. Friends, by the time trauma is affecting you physically, that's the brain stem, the bottom of your brain. By the time trauma has a physical manifestation in your body, what you need to understand is it's fought its way and it's affected the above 2 layers of your brain. So it's affecting now 2/3 of your brain before it starts affecting you physically. So when we talk about have you been traumatized, are you showing the signs of trauma, it's not only a physical response and a physical manifestation. By the time it's doing that, it's already gone through 2/3 of your functioning, your brain functioning, which is very important for us to understand. So let's talk about experience. Experience in a societal, a communal, and an individual level. So we looked at events, societally, communally, and individually. Our experiences, societally, communally, and individually. Friends, I believe that we all need to find a place where we can express and tell our experience, and likewise, we need to find a place, we need to be a place where people can share their experience of trauma. We're going to be sending out in the next day or two a trauma questionnaire, which is going to help you to understand perhaps some of the trauma you have been through and help us to help you to take a first step forward. And so we'll be sending that out probably on social media, but certainly through our WhatsApp group. So if you're not on our WhatsApp distribution system, won't you please get hold of us, info@anthem, send us the WhatsApp number is going to come up on the screen. Send a text to that WhatsApp number and simply say hi with your name so that we can put you on that distribution list. We want to help you to share your experience and to understand your experience, which will help you then process it and move on from it. So let's look at the effects. The societal effects of trauma. Remember, we said it's short and long term. So the societal effects is social and governmental collapse. And so we spoke in January about the social pandemic and how society collapses in on itself in the midst of a pandemic. So that we said the viral pandemic moves in waves. There's peaks and there's lows and there's peaks and there's lows. But the social aspect of it moves in cycles. It just keeps repeating on itself until society eventually collapses. All the social structures collapse. And governmental structures also collapse, because what happens is governmental structures go into a survival mode, and so they cease to function as they should correctly. That's the short and long-term effect on society. The short and long-term effects on a community is hypervigilance, fear and anger. We become triggered by circumstances that resemble the trauma, and we turn to isolation. Friends, hypervigilance, anger and fear that became so evident and obvious to me during the times of social unrest we had a couple of weeks ago. Community's response was hypervigilance. There was triggered by anger and fear, right? Both of those things. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just merely observing. That was the effect on a community. So every small action has a disproportionate response to us. We're hypervigilant. We're motivated by anger and fear at the same time. We're triggered by circumstances resembling the trauma. So that's why somebody who's been through war doesn't enjoy a fireworks show, right? Because the fireworks trigger them back to that war. They don't enjoy it. That's the effect on a community. And isolation. So communities, we said, even socially and societally, we become more isolated. And so communities, it's safer for them to just stay in their own houses. It's safer for them to retreat into themselves. And the effects of that trauma is that communities isolate themselves as opposed to coming together. And then on an individual scale, the effects of trauma, short or long term, is firstly the loss of rational thought. So remember we said that trauma affects your brain from the top to the bottom. So your prefrontal cortex is what controls your rational thought. The first thing to go in trauma is that you're unable to think rationally, to process rational thought. Before there's a physical manifestation, you're sleeping, you're eating, you're breathing, your concentration. If you're noticing an effect of trauma on that, you need to remember that it's gone through. Trauma has already affected 2/3 of your brain above that. Then failure to move, a loss of hope. I spoke about stagnation last week, and I was saying the longer you stagnate for, the longer you fail to take one step and progress and move, physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, or spiritually, you begin to lose hope. The longer you don't move, the more you begin to believe that movement is impossible, and so you begin to lose hope. And that's the effect in an individual. You lose hope. You lose hope, friends. So what should our response be? We said when we understand trauma, it's 3 things: events, how we experience those events, and then the effects of those events. Our response to it needs to be 3 things: realize, recognize, respond, and then resist re-traumatization. So to realize, the first thing, the most basic thing we can do to realize is that 2/3 of the people listening, and all of the people that are watching this today, have suffered 2 out of 3 on that trauma scale, societal, communal, and individual. Everybody listening is a 2 out of 3. Many people, if not most, are a 3 out of 3. And that's not just to the people listening, that's the people that you interact with every day. If you can realize that every single one of the people you interact with every day are 2 out of 3 on that scale, and many of them, if not most of them, are a 3 out of 3, that's 50% of the battle being won. 50% of the battle being run. So if I can realize that, so that the other morning we're getting ready for school. Obviously it's a bit of work in my house to get ready. We've got to get 7 of us out of the house, fed, watered, groomed, clothed by 7 o'clock, right? And so it's a bit of rush in the Salers household early in the morning. And my daughter was playing up. She seemed to be behaving poorly. She wasn't getting dressed. She wasn't eating her breakfast, and she was just messing around back in bed. And my instinct is to go and discipline her for that, right? And you need to sort this out and get back in line. And because I realized that she's been traumatized, she's suffering the effects of trauma. She's experienced trauma. I just took her to my room and I said to her, "Come, Sos, come sit on my bed. Let's you and me talk." I spoke kindly to her for 2 minutes. 2 minutes, and then I said, "Right, here's what we need to do. You need to go and have breakfast, and you need to get dressed." Within 5 minutes, she was sitting at the dining room table, eating breakfast, laughing with me. Went to school happy, simply because 50% of the battle had been won by me realizing that she'd been traumatized. We need to realize, friends. Secondly, we need to recognize, do you need further help? Are you seeing the signs in someone else? It's no good realizing that we've all traumatized. We sometimes need to recognize, actually, I can't find a way out of this. I need help processing this. And it's not just me. I'm seeing the signs in my children. I'm seeing the signs in my spouse. I'm seeing the signs in my friends and a couple of people in my community. I'm seeing the signs, and I'm recognizing that they need help. I need help, further help. And again, this is not to excuse poor behavior. This is to recognize sometimes there's a root of poor behavior, and it's sometimes trauma. Again, we're going to be sending out a trauma questionnaire this week. Please fill it in, get it back to us so that we can help you take a next step. It's no good recognizing. We want to help you to do something about it, to take a step. Some of the physical signs of trauma: insomnia, nightmares, fatigue, being startled easily, difficulty concentrating, racing heartbeat, edginess, agitation, aches and pains, muscle tension. Friends, are you recognizing some of those signs in yourself, in others? The psychological signs: shock, denial, disbelief, confusion, anger, irritability, mood swings, anxiety, fear, guilt and shame, withdrawing from others, feeling sad or hopeless, feeling disconnected or numb. Again, these are we don't excuse this behavior, but sometimes we need to recognize that there is a reason for that behavior. And so, are you seeing those signs in yourself? Are you seeing them in others? Let's help each other and people that we know take a step forward. Then thirdly, to respond, we need to commit to building a physically and psychologically safe environment that provides trust, fairness, and transparency. So I can hear some of the tough guys saying, a ship in harbour is safe, but ships weren't created to be in harbours, they were created to be on the high seas for adventures. I can hear that. And to which I say, that's right. I believe ships were created to be on the high seas and to have adventures and sailing into the sunset. That's what ships were created for. But if there's a hole in the side of your ship and you want to set it off for an adventure, it's going to drown, it's going to sink, and everybody on board is going to drown. Sometimes a harbour is a good place to be. If a ship is damaged, it needs to be in harbour, right? And so you need to commit to building a physically and psychologically safe environment. And that environment is your home. That environment is the people that you connect with. It's your community. That environment is your table. It's as your family sits around your table, you're asking yourself, what is the environment that I'm building here? Is it physically and psychologically safe? Or am I creating an environment that's hostile? So we spoke about words about a year ago, and we said the words that you speak become the bricks that you use to build the houses that you live in. So if you're not happy with the house that you live in, it's built by the bricks that are the words that you speak. So with your words, you can create an environment that's physically and psychologically safe or hostile. And as we respond to trauma, we always want to create that safe environment. And Joshua chapter 20, God provides what he calls cities of refuge. See, the law said, if a man kills another man, he must be stoned and put to death. And in Joshua 20, God says, I'm going to create these 6 cities as cities of refuge. If you have, by accident, murdered a person, you've suffered a trauma, it was an accident and you killed somebody, that's traumatic. You can, instead of being stoned immediately, you can flee to this city of refuge. You can plead your case, and they can then find a way for justice to be done. That is the first port of call is not to kill you, right? Trauma. Find a city of refuge, and then justice can be done. Friends, Jesus is a true and better city of refuge. He says you've been traumatized by sin or by another event, an experience, an effect. You've been traumatized. Come and find a place in me, a city of refuge in me, so that you can find health, healing, and wholeness, a physically and psychologically safe environment with me, so that you can then be a family that's healthy, that can have a fruitful mission. So our response should be to resist traumatization. Resisting traumatization, 50% of the battle is being aware, right? Adults can be unhelpful. That's fine. But there's no excuse for not being aware that I'm being unhelpful, right? My kids wanted to help us paint a wall, and it was unhelpful, but they were unaware that they were unhelpful. They were leaving blobs of paint everywhere, painting the floor, getting dirt in the paintbrush, and they were unaware of it because they're children. I tried to paint the wall, and I was aware that I was unhelpful, right? We were both unaware. We were both unhelpful. They were unaware of it. I was aware of it. That's what makes me an adult, and what makes them a children. Being aware of trauma is 50% of the battle. It's actually a sign of maturity, is being aware of things that we do that are unhelpful, things that we say that are unhelpful. We want to resist re-traumatization. The second thing we need to do is think before you ask or say something. This is your prefrontal cortex. This is higher functioning, right? There's a pause between action and reaction, between cause and effect. There's a pause. It's not just somebody slaps me and then I slap them back. Somebody slaps me and I look around to see if the teacher is watching, and then I think to myself, should I slap this person back before I slap them back? That's before you say something, before you do something, before you ask something, pause and think. We want to constantly resist re-traumatization of ourselves and of others. Thirdly, you want to protect your forwards. This is not soccer forwards. This is not rugby forwards. This is your text forwards. Protect your forwards. I'm constantly amazed that people forward pictures, videos, voice notes, links, texts that re-traumatize people, themselves and others. And friends, we are so unguarded with our forwards. We need to guard and protect our forwards. There's people in my phone that I look at them and I think, you know what? You're one bad forward away from being blocked. You're one bad forward away. If you forward me another bad thing, you're getting blocked. We just need to be so aware. We need to protect our forwards. So if somebody had lost a spouse in a motor accident, you wouldn't forward them videos, pictures, and links of more motor vehicle accidents, because you know that it's going to re-traumatize them. And yet we're so quick to do it with other things, and we perpetuate a cycle of trauma. We re-traumatize ourselves and others. And then lastly, friends, commit to moving forward, which is hope. Commit to taking one step from the circumstance that you find yourself in. Commit to taking one step forward. Don't stagnate. Remember, we said last week that the only difference between a rut and a grave is the depth. The longer you're stuck in that rut for, the longer you are stuck and unable to progress from that circumstance that you're in, whether it's psychologically, emotionally, mentally, physically, or spiritually, the longer you're unable to progress and take one step, the more likely you are to believe that it's impossible. And so hope begins to die. So commit today to taking one step. And that one step might be to fill out a trauma questionnaire and get it back to us. It might be to take a step towards Jesus for the first time. It might be a step to take. It might be to take one step further and deeper into community. And whatever that one step is, I want to encourage you to take it today, to commit to taking a step out of trauma. We want to help you to process that trauma so that you can move on into a healthy place, because a healthy family will have a fruitful mission. Friends, thank you for being with us today.